Come for the bread, stay for the politics. I'm Ben Walsh, and this is Let Them Eat Bread. As you can see, we're not in our usual studio right now because this really wasn't the episode that I wanted to film. I wanted to make crackers and show you all how to bake crackers in your kitchen, but we'll get to that another time. In the last couple of weeks, there have been a spate of mass shootings. I think it's now last month or so. It's been a spate of mass shootings across the U.S. Obviously, the one that got the most attention was in Uvalde, Texas, with a mass shooter in a school. My hometown in Philadelphia, there was a mass shooting here as well. And so I wanted to take some time, and I know I've talked about guns on the show before, but I wanted to take some time to talk about mass shootings and our gun problem and some history and some context and what's going on, my reaction to all of that. Because I think it's important that we have these conversations and we understand that there are solutions to these problems. We just have set the system up in a way that it's difficult to execute those solutions, and we've made it very difficult for us to get past kind of this ridiculous situation that we're in, which has persisted for decades now. So, obviously, the first initial response to any gun violence is shock, right? People's lives are cut short. You start to worry about friends of yours who are in the area of the mass shooting. You don't know if they've been affected, right? News comes out slowly. And as we saw with Uvalde, the information that was coming from the police and from individuals who were there at the scene was contradictory, right? And that lack of information creates fear and panic and distrust and all negative things. In fact, when the Philly mass shooting occurred, I was actually driving out of town. Luckily, I was nowhere nearby, but a friend of mine didn't know that. So she had reached out to me, and of course I'm driving, I can't check my phone. And so she then starts to panic because I'm not responding to her messages, right? And so, when I finally arrived and I saw that she was so panicked, I just made sure to call, right? And that just that small interaction is a microcosm of what happens to all of America, right? When you hear there's a mass shooting in your town or your friend's town, we panic, we fear, because we know gun violence can occur anywhere, right? Schools, movie theaters, grocery stores, synagogues, other houses of worship, churches have been targeted too. And we just look around and we see the places that we can feel safe as a population just shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, right? And there seem to be very few places where people can just kind of feel naturally safe. And so I think the first major push, other than safety, is like our psychological well-being as a country, right? We are so afraid that this is going to happen to us. I mean, when I go in places, I don't know about you, but when I go in places, that have one entrance or exit, I often look for an emergency exit, like if something happened, do I have to run towards the front of the store or whatever, right? Are there other ways to get out of here? And no one should ever have to think that, right? Especially not in relation to guns, where there is a malicious vector there, right? Maybe you think of like a fire exit, but it's different because a fire isn't malicious. It's just there, right? And it doesn't have that I can stand at the entrance and kill you as you're running towards me thing, right? You can see a fire, you can smell a fire, you can feel a fire, and you can move away from it, and the fire's not going to chase you, right? The fire is, a phenomenon that occurs chemically, right? And it expands naturally, organically. Shooters are malicious. They will follow people. They kill people on purpose. And so that brings us to this question, right? Because we're not the only country in the world that has guns. So is America uniquely violent? Is there something uniquely wrong with America? And, there have been a gazillion studies on this. And essentially, we're not uniquely anything except for our gun ownership. Gun ownership in the U.S. is incredibly high. There are more guns in the U.S. than people. Our citizenry is armed more capably is the wrong word, but more lethally than many militaries. There, if you start to put this together, we're drowning in a sea of guns, and we have an incredibly powerful lobby who's responsible for making sure that nothing ever gets done on that. But I want to talk. I'll talk more about that later. But American gun culture kind of solutions, solving our problems with guns, that allegedly comes from the Second Amendment. So I wanted to take some time today to go through the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and to talk a little bit about our Second Amendment and what it really means and where it comes from and why we have it, right? And I believe that doing these deep dives, these historical comparisons are helpful because it helps us understand where we come from. And with that knowledge and pairing that, of course, with understanding where we are today, I believe we can use that to move forward, right? And to have real, honest conversations about guns in America. Because truthfully, I think a lot of the conversations that we have in the US are not very honest, right? Especially at the political level, right? A lot of people are being funded by organizations that are, that see their goal as to sell more weaponry, right? And if your goal is to sell more weaponry, then you are not going to allow for gun control because that fundamentally stops weaponry from being purchased, right? So let's take a look at our dear Constitution here. And so I've pulled up the Bill of Rights. You may have seen it before. If you're not from the U.S., the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to our federal Constitution, and they were ratified pretty much right alongside the Constitution in 1789. And I want to focus. So the Bill of Rights fundamentally is a response to actions that the British colonial government took against colonists right before the Revolution, right? And I want to talk little bit by little bit about these and really see how we designed the Bill of Rights to be a fundamental rebuke of military law, right? Right after the French and Indian War ended in 1763, we start to 1768, sorry. We start to see a fundamental encroaching on what the colonists saw as their rights and privileges by the colonial government. And part of this was because there was some expectation by the crown that these colonies would pay for their own defense. The French and Indian War was incredibly expensive for the British Empire at the time. And so, when the colonists were not chuffed about paying, the government cracked down, as they felt was the right thing to do at the time to exact more money. But, looking back from independence, people looked at that time period and thought, hey, how can we not end up there again? And so I'm going to focus on 3 amendments specifically, but you can read through the entirety of the Bill of Rights, and pretty much all of it is a reaction to British colonial repression. So I'm going to start with the 4th Amendment, okay? The right of people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath of affirmation and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be searched. Why do we have this amendment, right? Why were people thinking about this in 1789? And the reason that they were, 1781, goodness. 1789 was the start of the French Revolution. The Constitution, 1781. My apologies. Sorry, history teachers. So the reason that this exists is because oftentimes British redcoats would just search houses for things when people were suspected of being of harboring seditionist thoughts or organizing against the crown. The government would just show up with men with guns, and they'd kick in doors, and they would search people, and they would harm people in ways that did not give what we now refer to as due process, right? The idea that people should be able to know what's coming from the government. They should be able to object to that if they see fit. Whether they win or lose is a different story, but there should be some way that a person knows what's going to happen, right? And that there's not there's a scope. And you'll often hear from reactionaries, oh well, if you got nothing to hide, why do you object to being searched? Because we're private individuals. Even in communitarian societies, there is a personal privacy. There are things that you do that should be yours alone, and that's not because they're wrong, but they might be unpopular, or you might do something differently than others and not want people to know about it, or be afraid that people are going to judge you or treat you differently. And regardless of what it is, there are just some things that people want to keep private, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And of course, I said that as a data privacy person, but truthfully, you know, there are personal things that are unique to you, things that are specific to you that the government doesn't need to know about, right? Even if you're not hiding them, the government doesn't need to know, right? So that's where the Fourth Amendment comes from, right? It's just not soldiers who were both acting as police and military at the time. Nowadays, it would just be police, right? From just kind of crashing in and searching whatever they want without anything. Now, of course, we are now very close to where we were with no-knock warrants and things like that. I don't want to dive too deep into that, but this was the idea, right? So let's go to the Third Amendment. This one is interesting, and it's a very specific reason we have this. Okay, no soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. Okay, so the reason we have this is because having all these, for the British Empire, having all these redcoats, what they called regulars, in the colonies was a massively expensive enterprise, as I mentioned earlier, right? And building fortresses to house them in was also very expensive, required a lot of land, required a lot of labor, required a lot of materials. It was much easier then to say, hey, everyone in this street is going to house a soldier, just one or two or whatever. And so, in order to reduce cost, soldiers were forced into these places. People weren't told that they were housing soldiers, and then they just were. Now, there's some historical humor here, because this kind of backfired, because the regulars would make plans about how they were going to fight the rebellion, especially what the revolutionaries, the American revolutionaries, and then the spies are just over here because it was like in their living room. So just a quick quirky thing there, but essentially this amendment is in specific response to that, right? We don't want soldiers living in our houses during peace or war, but if they are going to live in our house during war, then we want there to be people need to know what's coming to them, right? A lot of these are people need to know what's happening, right? There's a transparency in the Bill of Rights that wasn't available to the colonists when they were rebelling against the British Empire. And so this is a very strong reaction to that, right? And all the Bill of Rights is like this, but I want to go through these three because, again, they're very specific to the Revolutionary period. Now let's look at the Second Amendment, right? We all knew I was going here. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So there's a lot going on here, right? So I want to break this down and talk about it. So let's just start with this prefatory phrase here. A well-regulated militia. What did the militia mean in the 1760s, the 1770s, and the 1780s? Essentially, it meant a group of individuals who could be called up at any time for the defense of the town, right? Now, we had cities, right? And so they might have larger militias to come from. But if you think about towns that were close to Appalachia, which, remember, was essentially the western boundary of the colonies at the time, right? They didn't have a security service. They didn't have police, right? The town kind of did its own thing. You may have had a constable, but he wasn't going to fend off an army of people, right? And because there were frequent attacks on the colonies, you essentially had groups of individuals who came together, who were trained enough, right? Because they needed to be able to actually do the defending that they were tasked to do. So they would receive some training, they'd receive some compensation from the town, but it would just be their home musket, right? The same one they used for hunting, the same one they used, for keeping their personal property safe. They'd also be called upon to use that same musket and those same tools to defend their local town, right? So a well-regulated militia. So that's what that was. The town kept records of of who were part of the militias, and you could be called up, right? If people volunteered or everyone in the town did it, whatever. Well-regulated now means something very different than it did back then, right? We're not talking about in the time that this was written. We're not talking about like a bureaucratic state issuing regulations under the APA, right? It isn't happening like that, right? Well regulated meant that the local government was aware that they had the records on it and things. So it's difficult to translate that particular portion, the well regulated portion, to modern times, but we don't have militias anymore, right? And just staying here for another minute, this part of the Second Amendment, and actually I would argue the entire Second Amendment, essentially became obsolete when the Constitution allowed for the creation of a national military, right? Especially the National Guard, who essentially operates as the militia at the local level, right? Because states have their own National Guard units, right? Pennsylvania has one, New York has one, every state in the Union has one, right? And governors can call up the National Guard as a militia. Those aren't professional soldiers that are waiting to be around all the time. And you'll see, especially like on signs, when the government is trying to get you to sign up for the National Guard, they say, oh, you can do it part-time, right? You serve part-time in the National Guard. Tulsi Gabbard talked a lot about her experience in the National Guard and serving part-time after her tours overseas. And so it's the same basic concept. These people are well documented, they're trained, the government has put effort and resources into training them, and then they can be called up at any time to perform defensive functions, right? Now the National Guard isn't as much called up to do defensive functions anymore, but that's kind of where it all comes from, right? So let's move to the next phrase here. Being necessary for the security of a free state. Now this is talking about this militia, right? So what did this mean? So back then, we're thinking about, remember, not we like me and you, but the colonists had displaced a number of native tribes and had displaced French colonists after 1763 when the French had withdrawn from Appalachia. But that peace wasn't particularly stable, right? Native tribes would attack to try and drive off British colonists. French colonists would attack to drive off British colonists. You had this in the South near Florida with Spanish colonists as well. It was an uneasy peace, right? So in order for their state, as in the collective colonies, to be free, and they, of course, translated that to the Articles of Confederation and in the Constitution, they saw it necessary for there to be some level of armament and security. And that security came in the form of the militia that you could call up, right? Really, what the Second Amendment so far is an advocate for is for a National Guard that's locally based, right? Because that's essentially what they had and what they were using for their entirety of their defense, right? And they saw that as necessary for a free state because without that defense, the other groups that would attack would be able to drive them off and take away their freedom, right? That's how they saw it. And in some sense, that's how we still see it, right? Even though we span from sea to sea. So we're going to move now to the next one. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, I'm grouping these together, and I'll explain why in a second. This part is very important, and when this was being written, this part stung in the minds of what now Americans. And the reason for this is because if you think back to your history class, the first two major battles of the Revolutionary War were Lexington and Concord. What did those two battles have in common? The thing that they had in common was the British military, the regulars, were on their way to weapons depots to destroy the weapons depots and steal the weapons from the colonists in order to stop them from fighting back. This part right here, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, is a direct response to Lexington and Concord. It's not necessarily about you keeping your gun in your house, and many people did. But it's about it was about these storage depots. It's about your ability to defend your homestead in this very particular way, and for the government to not be able to go and especially when the government was so far away, right? You have to remember that all of this is in the context of a government that was 3,000 miles away, that was essentially executing martial law for the sole purpose of repressing the citizens into paying higher taxes, right? This is what all this was about. And then when war finally broke out, Lexington and Concord, the first thing the British regulars thought is, okay, well, let's just stomp out where all the guns are, right? It's just, you know. And another thing that I want to point out with this as well is that when the regulars were going to destroy these depots, essentially the weapons in there were more or less equivalent to the weapons that they were carrying on their shoulders. Weaponry had not evolved a ton. I mean, we didn't even have replaceable parts back then, right? People were guns, muskets, musketoons, and all those were essentially bespoke pieces that gunsmiths would make. They were highly valuable, highly prized, and you needed to be extremely talented to make one. Okay, obviously guns have changed significantly since then, and there's no longer an equivalency between what the military has and what people can get. Even the AR-15 does not hold a candle to the assault weaponry that the U.S. military has access to and uses. Okay, but this portion here, they were so afraid that this type of thing would happen again, that a strong central government, and remember, Washington was so popular, they could have made him king, but they didn't, right? But they were so afraid that the government would destroy these depots, would stop the militias. Again, all this whole sentence is in the context of this militia, right? The idea of the local town defense. They were afraid of a strong national government. The way that we have evolved as a national society makes essentially all of this obsolete. And that would have remained true, and our fundamental idea of what gun culture is would have changed, but for the Heller decision by Scalia. So I believe it was 2011. You'll have to check me on that because I don't have it in front of me. But I believe in 2011 you had Heller versus District of Columbia, and this court case was about an individual who was carrying a handgun in Washington, D.C., where it was illegal to do so, openly. And they got caught, whether intentionally or not. It's hard to say. Sometimes there's, efforts to get court cases in front of the Supreme Court. I don't know if that part of it was intentional, but essentially this person was caught doing this, and they kept fighting and fighting and fighting, and eventually this case ends up before the Supreme Court. And at that point, Scalia, writing for the majority, essentially says that this portion right here, the right of people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, essentially allows for anyone. It changed overnight the culture of guns in America. The culture that we see now didn't exist before Heller. It just didn't. This idea that you can kind of strap on and go anywhere and it not be a problem, it didn't really exist. And so the NRA, in combination with Scalia's ruling, and created this as an issue and encouraged people to buy more guns. And remember, the NRA, wholly funded by gun manufacturers. They are just lining the pockets of their daddies. It's a crude way to talk about it, but it's true. So this line, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, was fundamentally manipulated outside of its historical context for the sole purpose of benefiting the gun lobby and their donors. And so the reason I wanted to spend so much time on this particular piece of this particular amendment was to talk to you about the fact that the way that this was written, the way that this was understood at the time, is fundamentally different from what we see it now. Now, does that really get us anywhere in terms of changing the conversation? I don't know. And my guess is it probably doesn't, right? We're in a very polarized society, and people are not exactly want to, change their political beliefs based on, historical context and things like that. And by the way, historical context can't always save us. I know I'm going down a rabbit hole a little bit, but I think this is important. We can't always rely on the way things were written to help inform us on how they should be done now, because society has changed, right? Like I said with this, the militias had muskets, the regulars had muskets. It was essentially the same weapon. Now, the ones that the regulars had probably better made, right? They probably better quality. They probably had nicer bullets, but they were fundamentally the same weapon. It still took, at best, you could fire 3 rounds every 48 seconds, and you had to be trained for years to do that. Only the elite troops of the British Empire could fire that quickly. Otherwise you might get 2 rounds off in that time. We didn't have the type of weaponry we have now. Even the Gatling gun is still another century away. even magazines, like magazines for weapons that we take for granted today. The Henry Repeater rifle was a 5-clip weapon, and it was invented in 1860. Okay, when this is written, we are over 100 years away from a rifle or any weapon being able to shoot remotely quickly, right? And by the way, weapons also got much shorter too. A rifle at this time is about 48 inches long, which very tall, right, for a weapon. You wouldn't see like something like that today. So all of this is to say that we have steered away over the course of our history from what the Second Amendment was meant to be. And the Second Amendment just simply doesn't take account for the fact that Americans have learned to live and love and trust, in some manners, a strong national government, right? We didn't go with a model of strong states. Now, in some legal ways, the states have plenary power, but for the most part, the federal government has plenary power. And that is something that we have learned to adapt to over the course of American history. And it's not been a problem. But the type of strong central government that they were afraid of here is very different than the one that we have now, right? So as you go through and you're thinking about this from a historical perspective, oh, my Second Amendment rights, my Second Amendment rights. Anyone who says the words my Second Amendment rights fundamentally misunderstands where the Second Amendment comes from. The Second Amendment was a communitarian protection piece of language. It had nothing to do with individual rights. It was always, always about the community, about protecting your community, about making sure that an outsider, sometimes your own government, right, your monarch, your authoritarian regime, could not come in and take that security away from you. That doesn't happen now. Not in that way, right? You can argue all day, but essentially, I wanted to talk about this part of it because I think it's helpful for our understanding to see what it was really like way back. So that brings us to the modern era, right? What now? We understand our history. We understand what's happening. What can we do to stop mass shootings in America? Well, first and foremost, we can do what every other country has done, but we can fundamentally rethink the way that we have gun culture in America. Why do people need guns? Right? We can go back to the very fundamental questions. So if you're in the wilderness and you are disconnected from the grid, or you are outside of the regular course of the market economy, for all its failures, you probably need a gun to hunt. And look, maybe you have a gun for recreation. I would argue you could leave it at the range, but whatever, right? Maybe you have a range on your own property, whatever it is. The reason that you need a gun has nothing to do with your security from a free state perspective. It just doesn't. That threat doesn't exist any longer. The free statism is guaranteed by the people that we pay taxes to, whether it's police, or the military, also, But still, those institutions are there, and we as a society have created them and trusted them to do those things. Whether they did them or not is a different story. But we changed the way that we understand what gun ownership is. Gun ownership now is about sustainability and sport, and it's primarily sport and hobbyism, right? People like guns. They like the ability to take them apart and put them back together again. There's a hobbyism to it. And look, there's nothing wrong with sport hunting and hobbyism. I don't necessarily want to take away everyone's guns who does it for hobby or sport. But you should, and by the way, this is the argument the right makes all the time, right? Oh, you're going to punish law-abiding citizens. Law-abiding citizens aren't going into schools and murdering people. And they're not picking up guns and then using them. And they're not afraid to fail a criminal background check. You know why? Because they're law-abiding citizens, right? You can fundamentally undercut the right's argument by just mentioning that fact that I just told you. If you were really concerned about the rights of law-abiding citizens, then you wouldn't be afraid to put them up to a background check. All of us have backgrounds, and our backgrounds are run for all sorts of things: credit checks, mortgages, your employment, right? When you want to buy a car, all that stuff. Everyone runs background checks. So why can't we do for guns, right? So that would be a good way to do it. Waiting periods as well, right? And this one's great to throw on the right's face because they love the idea of of waiting periods for abortions. Hey, look, if I can get a gun the same day, you should be able to get an abortion the same day. Why not, right? And if you think that should be waiting periods for abortions because it's the taking of a life, then guess what? You should be able to wait that same amount of time for a gun. Because what does a gun do? It can take a life. And it can take way more lives than an abortion can. I mean, you can do that by killing 2 people, right? But so these arguments are silly, and they're all in defense of the gun manufacturing industry. But not only can we do background checks, we do gun buybacks, which have been wildly successful. I worked for the Attorney General's office in New Jersey, and way back when, and there was a gun buyback that was done during the time. It was amazingly successful. People turned in all sorts of weaponry. They were happy to get rid of them. There was no coercion. It was like, hey, come, we'll buy it at market value, right? And you significantly reduced the number of guns that were on the street, and those weapons were able to be melted down, and those materials used for better things. And so, you can implement multiple strategies for this, right? Background checks, waiting periods, gun buybacks. You can limit the amount of magazines. Look, if you're hunting in for sport, you do not need a magazine longer than 5. The deer is not shooting back. Your target at the other end of your range can wait for you to reload, right? There is no good argument for why you need 30 bullets in a clip. You can also restrict the number of bullets that can be fired per second. You can restrict semi-autos. You can restrict muzzles, attachments, and things like that. You can make it so that people can have guns, but not in a way that the military has guns. Because in every situation where an America is going to use a gun, even in ways that we don't want them to, it is exceedingly rare that there's someone shooting back. And because of that, you don't need a weapon that accounts for the fact that someone will be shooting back at you. So let's look at what other countries have done, right? Because the US is not only the only country in the world that has had mass shootings, okay? But other countries have dealt with this in a way that makes a lot more sense. So this is kind of small. Let me see if I can make this a little bigger. Yeah, it's not really getting much bigger. We're just going to kind of deal with this. Hopefully you can read it. If not, I'll read off what I'm, as a reading off. So, 1996, 35 people were killed at a cafe in Australia, and they passed strict gun control. And by the way, it says, despite fierce opposition from the gun lobby. We have one of those. We could fight them. They will oppose anything that we put down. Even the simplest shit they will put down, right? They'll say they don't like it. But passed gun control regulation, including ban on semi-automatics, semi-automatic and pump-action shotguns. Part of the reform, unlicensed firearms were surrendered. All licensed gun owners required to take a safety course. By the way, we should do that too, right? You should know gun safety if you're going to have a gun. You have to take a car safety course for a car. You have to take a boat safety course to buy a boat to get your boating license, right? And if you don't have it, by the way, if you just take your boat and go out, the Coast Guard can seize that boat from you. They can take that boat away. Okay, I know I had an uncle who was a captain. So we are so careful for vehicles. You have to get a separate license if you want to drive a truck, an 18-wheeler, a motorcycle, right? Why not a gun? And so, other than the numbers you can see here, 650,000 firearms were confiscated and destroyed. Wild, okay? But there were no mass shootings for 14 years after the laws were passed. There have been a few incidents in Australia and since the laws have been enacted, but very few, right? In America, there's a mass shooting every day. If you're a child in America, you are more likely to die by gun death than anything else. That's ridiculous. It should not be that way. In Canada, in 1999, 14 female college students studying engineering were killed in a classroom. Canada adopted legislation mandating background checks, safety courses, and penalties for gun-related crimes, okay? After another mass shooting in 2020, 1,500 models of military-grade assault rifles were banned. Okay? We have the tools. Other countries have reduced the amount of gun crime and gun deaths in their country. And by the way, in the wake of the Uvalde, Texas shooting, one that did not occur in Canada, Canada is going to implement even tougher gun laws, including toys that resemble guns will be subject to a ban. Now that one I think's a little much. I don't think, for me, the toy gun thing is like the violence from video game thing. I don't really think it's there. I'd be interested to see a study if children who play with guns are more likely to become shooters. I don't think you would be able to find the data there. I don't think it exists. So I think that particular part is a little too far, but essentially stopping the sale of a lot of different types of guns is going to stop there from being guns out there, right? Buybacks, confiscations, all these things. It's important for reducing the number. And by the way, regardless of what it's considered the right for us to have, right? How it gets interpreted. All rights have limits. The First Amendment has limits. I cannot run into a crowded theater and say fire because I'll cause a stampede and people will die. I can't run into a concert venue and say the same thing because people will get trampled and die, right? I cannot use my speech to directly harm another individual, whether by telling, fans of my show, however many they might be, shout out to all fans, by the way, go harm so-and-so, right? That's illegal. I can't do that. I could argue freedom of speech, but the Supreme Court and the Constitution is clear. You can't do that, right? And so all of our rights have limits. Every right that you can think of has limits, right? I want there to be abortion rights. Guess what? The abortion right that I want has limits, okay? So when you think about rights, you can't think about them in an unfettered manner. That's, to pull a line from Star Wars, only a Sith talks in absolutes, right? Absolutes are silly. They don't work. So let's look at New Zealand. And everyone remembers the Christchurch shooting. 50 people were killed in Christchurch, and within days they had banned the sales of assault weapons. Right? They voted to prohibit the circulation and use of most semi-auto fire weapons and convert firearms into semi-autos. Right? Immediately they saw a problem, instituted a solution. And look, it's never going to be easy. It'll be harder in the US, but it wasn't easy in these places either. But they saw a problem and they instituted a solution. Solutions that we could easily implement here. And actually, I love this quote by Jacinda Ardern. We have legitimate needs for guns in our country, for things like pest control and to protect our biodiversity. But you don't need a military-style semi-automatic to do that. And it's true, right? Most people who are real hunters, they don't use AR-15s. They use a long rifle or a crossbow, something that is quiet enough, something that gives them the ability to aim steadily, and something that's not very clunky because they need to be able to move quickly and quietly and to essentially ambush their prey and then kill quickly and accurately. And an AR-15 is not that weapon. A long gun is that weapon. And a long gun, if it's not a bolt action, is going to have a very small clip, just inherent to the nature of the weapon. Let's look at Britain. So 1996, I think that was the same year as the Canada one. 16 children were killed by a former scout leader, and essentially after that, British lawmakers effectively banned private ownership of all handguns in mainland Britain. And a firearm amnesty resulting in the surrender of thousands of guns. By the way, we could do that too. We could say, look, we're going to make guns illegal, or we're going to make certain types of guns illegal. And if you are found with them, you'll face these penalties starting in 2025. You've got from now and then to surrender them. We'll pay you market value for them, right? We actually have in the Constitution the ability, and it's called, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting my Latin. I can't think of what it is. That's embarrassing. But essentially, there's a mechanism by which a government can seize items for market value and compensate people for market value of those items, and that will allow for people to get value of the guns. Look, guns are expensive. I get that, and a lot of people get that. So if we're going to take guns away, we have to make sure that people are compensated for that. And I think that's fair. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, okay? And so if that's the route we choose to go down, then let's do it. But as you can see, other countries have figured this out. And I don't want you to come away from this video thinking that America's stupid, because we're not. We know exactly what we can do. We just choose not to do it. So why? Why do we choose not to do it? Obviously, the biggest reason is money in politics, okay? Is these candidates take money from the National Rifle Association, who takes money from the gun manufacturers to lobby them, and they refuse to pass anything that could reduce the sales of weapons. By the way, not only that, there's a second angle here, and shout out to, I think it was Jonathan Larson of TYT for pointing this out. Not only are politicians being bribed by the NRA, they are invested in gun manufacturers. So when the NRA bribes them and they don't pass gun reform after a mass shooting, their stock portfolio increases. How fucked up is that? People who are supposed to be protecting us, who we elected to protect us, are profiting off of mass shootings. It's insane. By the way, one of the things that you'll see, so first of all, obviously, we need to get money out of politics in general, but I want to talk about another facet of the money in politics thing. It's slightly tangential, but I think you'll understand where I'm coming from. So after the shootings, you saw a lot of corporate responses, right? And corporations, they love to just say shit, right? They love to be like, oh, like, and we're in June, right? It's Pride Month. Find me a corporate logo that hasn't changed for Pride Month, okay? But they don't mean it, right? I'm pretty sure Chick-fil-A probably changes their logo too, and right, they actively hate the LGBTQIA community. QIA plus community. My bad, y'all. But so one of the things that you've seen from corporations a lot recently is, oh, like if our employees donate to this charity, we'll match it or we'll double match it, which sounds really great, but it's wholly self-interested. Let me tell you why. Corporations are able to write off any donations they make on their taxes and to reduce the total amount of corporate income tax that they pay, just like you can, right? It's much harder for you to do that, of course, because it requires a lot more donations and we're all poor. But essentially, the corporation has made a calculated decision. And look, I don't know who's in the ear of these CEOs who make these declarations. I don't know who it is. And I don't want to believe that people are evil, and I don't want to believe that, people are inherently opposed to doing the right thing. But whoever is telling them to do this, they know that the corporation benefits by reducing their taxes. They're not. I don't know if they're really these executives really care about gun violence or not, and it doesn't matter. Okay, I'm not impugning anybody, but the truth is, if they don't hurt themselves by double or triple matching your donation to a gun safety organization, okay? They just don't. It doesn't hurt them. They're not bothered by it. It doesn't affect them. Now, there is a thing corporations could do that will affect them, that will be difficult for them to do, and you won't see any of them do it, okay? But the thing that they could do, instead of matching your donation, and by the way, even donating themselves, same thing. It's just a tax write-off. Do not allow corporations to convince you that they're doing the right thing by making donations. They are not. It is a lie, okay? It is self-interested through and through. I don't care what anybody says, it's true, okay? What corporations could do, which would fundamentally be harmful to them, but would show that they really mean it, stop funding politicians that take NRA money. Just stop doing it. Say as a corporate policy, because you're not allowed to say it to politicians directly, okay? Because then it looks like a bribe. It's a bribe. Say as a company policy on your website, we're really concerned about these mass shootings, and because of that, we feel that it would be morally wrong to donate to a politician's campaign, any politician's campaign that works with or takes money from the National Rifle Association or gun or weapons manufacturers. That's it. Simple statement, 2 sentences long. That would fundamentally hurt a corporation because they would stop having the ear of politicians. And by the way, politicians will sometimes be spiteful to them for that. Okay? Because the whole system's corrupt. All right? But that would be real. That would really show that a corporation cared enough to sacrifice something in response to these gun deaths. but they won't do it because they're not really willing to make a sacrifice. They want to look good, they want to have great PR, they want to say they fund all these organizations, but it's just a tax write-off. And it's a tax write-off at the expense of your kids, of your emotional well-being, like we talked about earlier, at the expense of your safety. Corporations will reduce their taxes to make it look like they care about gun violence in America when they fundamentally do not. Okay. So I want to close all this out by just kind of quickly recapping what we've talked about today. So we started off by talking about the mental toll that gun violence takes on Americans. And it's true. And every American watching this knows and has been afraid at some point that someone that they know or love has been near or in the crossfire of gun violence. Okay. After that, we talked about whether America is truly unique in gun violence. And yes, we are. Are we uniquely stupid? Do we have unique amounts of mental health crises in this country? No. What we have is a unique amount of guns. After that, we talked about the Bill of Rights, how the Bill of Rights was specifically a discussion back to, yes, a Valiant Thor. How about sending $40 billion to Ukraine? We spend that money securing hospitals, schools, and communities. That's an interesting question, but that is not going to save us, right? Good guy with a gun doesn't save us. We had good guys with guns in Uvalde. They stood outside. They putzed for an hour. How does that save us? It doesn't. You know what we could do with that money? Tell you what, with $40 billion, we could implement a gun buyback. We could create a general amnesty. We could pay people double market value. Okay, you paid $100 for a gun, great, we'll give you $200 for it. We could allow people to give back these terrible weapons for money. I get it, guns are expensive. Okay, people want to keep them because they're valuable. So just allow them to have that. Allow them to have that money. Use it for something else. No, it is the answer. I specifically talked about this earlier. Go back and watch the video, my friend. I think you'll find that my points are rather interesting, even if you disagree. So the other thing that we talked about, just going back to my conclusion here, is we talked about the fundamental underpinnings of where the Bill of Rights comes from, how it's a direct reaction to our oppression from the British Empire back in the 1760s. And the second to last thing we talked about was how have other countries dealt with this? How have those countries created an environment where they are able to protect themselves from gun violence? Okay? Because those countries have been able to protect themselves from outside threats, from internal threats, and they don't have gun violence like we do in the US. And the last thing I talked about was the corporate response and the money and politics angle of this. And it's important fundamentally to remember that we have a national problem, a fundamental problem in our politics, one that is the baseline for every other every other problem that we have, is that our politics is flooded with money from top to bottom. Get all money out of politics. I don't care who it comes from. But the NRA is the main barrier between us and good, honest, careful, and thoughtful gun regulation. So I hope that you have found my discussion here insightful. I hope that when you have conversations about gun violence and our reactions to gun violence, you think about what I've said. You push back on people who say that we can't have this, right? You look at the ways that other countries have dealt with this, and you understand that there are solutions out there. And most importantly, I hope that all of you are safe in your home, store, wherever you're listening to this, wherever you're going after you've listened to this. We can have a safer world and a safer country. And it starts with making sure that our house is in order. And so, I hope that we're all safe. I hope that you're safe. I hope that I'm safe. And there are solutions out there. Don't get discouraged, guys. It's a tragedy. All these are tragedies, and we want to do the right thing. We just now have to get there. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. I anticipate there being an episode next week. I hope to make crackers. I can't wait to make those with you. We'll have some fun cracker varieties to hang out and bake. and hopefully we'll have some new stories for you guys as well. All right, guys, take care. Have a great one.